There are individuals who feel weighed down by life long before life has given them any clear reason to feel so. They sense an invisible demand placed upon them, a pressure that does not come from society, family, or circumstance, but from within. This burden is often misunderstood as weakness, misfortune, or excessive sensitivity, yet it persists with remarkable consistency. What troubles such individuals is not external hardship, but an inner summons that refuses to be ignored. To understand this burden is not to escape it, but to recognize that the psyche itself is calling for something essential, something that, if left unanswered, will shape life through conflict rather than meaning. There comes a moment in the life of an individual when something within begins to press forward with quiet insistence. It does not arrive with applause, nor does it ask for permission. It announces itself as tension, an unease that refuses to be silenced. Many mistake this moment for ambition or destiny, but it is neither. It is the psyche demanding reorganization. It is the unconscious insisting that the current way of being is no longer sufficient. This call is often misunderstood as a gift, as though one has been selected for greatness. In truth, it is closer to an inner compulsion. The individual does not feel elevated by it, they feel burdened. Sleep becomes restless. Familiar pleasures lose their flavor. The world that once felt stable begins to feel strangely narrow. This is not because the world has changed, but because the individual has outgrown the structure that once contained them. When such a call is ignored, the psyche does not remain silent. It expresses itself through anxiety, irritability, depression, and a persistent sense of meaninglessness. These are not illnesses in the ordinary sense. They are signals. The unconscious, unable to speak directly, communicates through disturbance. What is commonly labeled as weakness is often the consequence of a deeper strength being denied expression. The individual who carries this call often wonders why life feels heavier for them than for others. They look around and see people who seem content with repetition, with borrowed opinions, with lives shaped entirely by external expectation. The contrast creates confusion and at times resentment. Yet this difference is not moral or intellectual, it is psychological. The inner demands placed upon one psyche are not identical to those placed upon another. The call emerges when latent potential begins to activate. But potential is not a pleasant thing. It is raw, unformed, and disruptive. It demands sacrifice before it offers clarity. The chosen one, if such a term must be used, is not chosen for comfort, but for confrontation. Confrontation with their own limitations, their own fears, and the fragile constructions of identity they once relied upon. This necessity is why the call cannot be treated as optional. One may attempt to suppress it through distraction, conformity, or excessive rationalization, but suppression only drives it deeper, where it gains strength. The unconscious does not relinquish its demands simply because the ego finds them inconvenient. On the contrary, what is repressed returns with greater force, often in distorted and destructive forms. The call disrupts relationships as well. Others sense the inward movement taking place, even if they cannot name it. The individual becomes less predictable, less easily categorized. This unsettles those who depend on stability and familiarity. Misunderstanding follows, sometimes hostility. Yet this too is part of the psychological pressure shaping the individual toward a more authentic center. It is important to understand that this call is not proof of superiority. It does not imply moral elevation or special entitlement. It is a task, not a reward. The psyche is seeking balance, and balance requires differentiation. What has remained unconscious must be brought into awareness, and what has been lived unconsciously can no longer continue in the same manner. Those who experience this call often feel as though life has placed a weight upon them without explanation. But this weight is not arbitrary. It is the pressure required to forge a more complete personality. Without it, the individual would remain partial, divided, living only on the surface of themselves. The call insists on depth, and depth is never achieved without strain. This is why the burden feels inescapable. It is not imposed from the outside, it arises from within. And as long as the psyche seeks wholeness, the call persists quietly, relentlessly, until it is met with awareness rather than avoidance. Isolation is the price of inner truth. When an individual begins to live in accordance with inner truth, a subtle separation occurs. It is not chosen deliberately, nor is it driven by a desire to withdraw from others. It happens because inner truth alters perception. What once felt acceptable now feels false, and what once felt harmless begins to feel empty. The individual does not leave the crowd slowly moves away. Isolation in this sense is not merely physical solitude. It is the experience of standing psychologically apart. One may remain among others, speak their language, fulfill social roles, yet feel an increasing distance that cannot be bridged by politeness or routine conversation. This distance arises because inner truth demands sincerity, and sincerity is disruptive to collective comfort. Most human relationships are built upon shared illusions, agreements, often unspoken, about what will not be questioned. When an individual withdraws belief from these illusions, even silently, the structure of connection weakens. Others sense the difference. They may not understand it intellectually, but they feel it emotionally. The individual no longer reflects the group back to itself, and this absence creates unease. This isolation is frequently misunderstood as arrogance or emotional coldness. In reality, it is a consequence of inward alignment. The psyche that has turned toward its own depths cannot remain entirely accessible to surface-level exchange. Depth introduces gravity, and gravity pulls one away from triviality without effort or intention. The burden here lies not in being alone, but in being seen as strange for refusing to betray inner experience. The individual becomes careful with words, not out of secrecy, but because language often fails to convey inner realities without distortion. What is most meaningful feels vulnerable when exposed to misunderstanding, and so silence becomes a form of protection. Inner truth also disrupts the need for approval. As the individual becomes more rooted in their own psychological center, external validation loses its authority. This shift unsettles social bonds that were unconsciously maintained through mutual reassurance. When approval is no longer sought, the exchange changes, and many relationships cannot survive this change. Isolation deepens when the individual realizes that no one else can walk this inner path for them. Advice becomes less useful, not because others lack wisdom, but because the task is uniquely personal. Each psyche has its own structure, its own symbols, its own unresolved tensions. To follow inner truth is to accept that guidance can point, but cannot accompany. There is also a quieter form of isolation that emerges within the self. Parts of the personality that once cooperated begin to conflict. Old identities resist dissolution. Inner truth does not unify immediately. It divides before it integrates. The individual feels torn between who they have been and who they are becoming. This internal loneliness is often more difficult than the absence of external companionship. Yet isolation is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the psyche is differentiating itself from collective patterns. Individuation, by its very nature, separates before it connects at a deeper level. One cannot become oneself by remaining entirely absorbed in the expectations of others. The danger arises when isolation is mistaken for a final state rather than a condition of transformation. Withdrawal without reflection hardens into bitterness. Solitude without awareness becomes emptiness. But when isolation is held consciously, it becomes a space in which inner figures can speak. Dreams intensify, symbols emerge, and previously ignored aspects of the personality demand recognition. The individual learns, often painfully, that inner truth does not promise belonging in the ordinary sense. It offers something else, coherence. To stand inwardly united, even when outwardly alone, is a form of stability that does not depend on agreement or applause. This stability does not announce itself loudly, but it reshapes the way one inhabits the world. Isolation, then, is not an abandonment by life. It is the consequence of refusing to live falsely. And as long as inner truth continues to assert itself, this distance remains, not as punishment, but as the cost of psychological integrity. As consciousness expands, it casts a longer shadow. This is not a moral failure, nor is it a sign of corruption. It is a psychological law. Whatever becomes illuminated in the personality inevitably reveals what has been excluded, denied, or left behind. The more one strives toward clarity, responsibility, or virtue, the more forcefully the opposite tendencies gather strength in the unconscious. The shadow is not composed merely of what is evil or destructive. It contains everything the ego has refused to recognize as its own: aggression, envy, fear, hunger for power, but also creativity, intensity, and instinctual vitality often lie buried there. What unites these elements is not their darkness, but their rejection. They were incompatible with the image the individual needed to survive, to belong, or to be admired. When the individual begins to move toward inner truth, when they attempt to live more consciously, the ego tightens its grip. It wants to define itself as enlightened, disciplined, or morally superior. This effort, though understandable, deepens the split within the psyche. The shadow responds by growing more autonomous, more charged, more likely to erupt in moments of stress or fatigue. One often sees this in those who pursue ideals with excessive rigidity. The stronger the identification with goodness, the more dangerous the unacknowledged impulses become. Rage appears where calm is expected. Contempt arises beneath compassion. The individual is shocked by their own reactions and struggles to reconcile them with the identity they have constructed. Yet the psyche is not impressed by self-images. It insists on wholeness, not perfection. The shadow does not announce itself politely. It enters through projections. The individual sees in others what they cannot tolerate in themselves. Enemies multiply. Moral outrage intensifies. The world begins to appear hostile, stupid, or corrupt. In truth, the battlefield lies within. What is judged most harshly outside is often what seeks recognition inside. As the light of consciousness grows brighter, it threatens the shadow with extinction. But the shadow does not disappear when threatened. It resists. It gathers energy precisely because it has been excluded from participation in conscious life. This resistance is experienced as inner conflict, temptation, irrational behavior, or sudden emotional excess. The ego feels betrayed by itself, unaware that the betrayal occurred long ago when parts of the personality were condemned to darkness. There is danger in misunderstanding this process. Many attempt to destroy the shadow through discipline, suppression, or spiritual bypassing. They speak of transcending the ego while secretly inflating it. This only strengthens the shadow further, granting it a demonic quality it did not originally possess. What is rejected absolutely becomes hostile absolutely. The shadow grows stronger not because the individual is failing, but because the psyche is seeking balance. Consciousness without integration is brittle. It lacks depth and resilience. The shadow, though frightening, carries psychological vitality. It contains instinct, passion, and groundedness, qualities necessary for a fully lived life. Without them, consciousness becomes sterile and disconnected from reality. To encounter the shadow is to experience discomfort. It humbles the ego. It reveals that the individual is not as unified, rational, or virtuous as they believed. This realization is often resisted with great force, yet without it, development stalls. One remains divided, driven by unconscious forces while claiming conscious control. The shadow also explains why those who carry great potential often experience intense inner turbulence. The more energy available to the personality, the more violent the conflict between what is known and what is hidden. Light does not eliminate darkness, it defines it. And as long as consciousness continues to expand, the shadow will continue to press forward, demanding acknowledgement rather than condemnation. This tension is not meant to be resolved quickly. It is meant to be endured consciously. The psyche is not seeking comfort, it is seeking completeness, and completeness requires that the individual recognize not only what they aspire to be, but also what they are capable of becoming when unconscious forces are left unattended. Suffering enters human life not as an intruder, but as a messenger. It speaks when other forms of communication have failed. The psyche does not resort to pain without reason. It does so when the individual has drifted too far from inner necessity, when adaptation to the outer world has come at the expense of inner truth. In such moments, suffering becomes the only language strong enough to interrupt the illusion of stability. There is a widespread belief that suffering is an error, something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. This belief misunderstands the nature of psychological development. Comfort preserves what already exists. It does not create change. Transformation requires tension, and tension is experienced subjectively as suffering. Without it, the personality remains fixed, repeating familiar patterns long after they have lost meaning. Suffering often appears first as confusion. One no longer understands oneself. Desires contradict values. Motivation collapses without explanation. The individual may attempt to restore order through logic, productivity, or distraction, but the disturbance persists. This persistence is significant. It indicates that the issue lies not in circumstances, but in structure, in the way the psyche is organized. When suffering deepens, it strips away false certainty. The ego, which depends on control and predictability, finds itself inadequate. This inadequacy is humiliating, and yet it is necessary. As long as the ego believes it can manage life through conscious intention alone, it resists transformation. Suffering weakens this resistance, not to destroy the ego, but to make it permeable. In this sense, suffering functions as a dissolving agent. It breaks rigid identifications. Roles that once defined the individual begin to feel hollow. Achievements lose their power to reassure. Beliefs that once offered orientation begin to fracture. This disintegration is often mistaken for collapse, but psychologically it is a precondition for reorganization. Something new cannot emerge until the old form loosens its grip. The chosen individual, burdened by inner demands, often experiences suffering with unusual intensity. This is not because they are fragile, but because the psyche is attempting a deeper rearrangement. Superficial adjustments are insufficient. The transformation required reaches into instinct, emotion, and identity. Such depth cannot be accessed gently. Suffering also reveals what has been avoided. Pain draws attention to neglected aspects of the personality, unlived impulses, unacknowledged grief, repressed anger. These elements return not as abstract insights, but as lived experience. The body becomes involved, energy fluctuates, sleep, appetite, and mood shift. The psyche demands engagement at every level, not merely intellectual understanding. There is a temptation to romanticize suffering, to see it as proof of depth or destiny. This is another misunderstanding. Suffering is not valuable in itself. It has value only insofar as it leads to awareness. When endured unconsciously, it hardens the personality. Bitterness replaces insight. The individual identifies with their pain and defends it as identity. Transformation halts and suffering becomes repetitive rather than revelatory. But when suffering is faced without premature interpretation or escape, it begins to speak more clearly. Patterns emerge, symbols appear in dreams, emotional reactions reveal hidden loyalties and fears. The psyche, once chaotic, begins to organize its messages. Meaning does not eliminate pain, but it alters the individual's relationship to it. What was previously overwhelming becomes instructive. This is why suffering cannot be rushed. The psyche unfolds according to its own rhythm. Attempts to force resolution often prolong distress. Transformation is not an act of will, it is a process of alignment. The ego must learn to listen rather than command. Suffering persists as long as something essential remains unrealized. It eases not when life becomes easier, but when the personality becomes more truthful. And as long as the psyche continues its movement towards wholeness, suffering remains present, not as an enemy, but as the pressure that shapes what is still forming. Responsibility precedes freedom. The longing for freedom is one of the most powerful forces within the human psyche. Yet this longing is often misunderstood. Many imagine freedom as the absence of limitation, the removal of obligation, the right to act without consequence. Psychologically, this notion is immature. True freedom does not emerge from escape, but from structure. It is not granted first, it is earned through responsibility. Responsibility begins inwardly, long before it appears in outer commitments. It begins with the recognition that one's inner life is not accidental. Thoughts, emotions, impulses, and fantasies are not random disturbances imposed from outside. They are expressions of the psyche seeking order. To be responsible is to stop treating these inner forces as strangers and to acknowledge authorship of one's own psychological reality. The individual who avoids responsibility remains enslaved to unconscious forces. They speak of fate, circumstance, or other people as though these were the true agents of their life. In doing so, they preserve the illusion of innocence, but at the cost of autonomy. What is not taken into conscious responsibility does not disappear. It governs from below. Such a person may feel free in intention, yet they are driven in action. Freedom without responsibility is merely impulse. It appears spontaneous, but it lacks direction. The personality fragments pulled by momentary desires and reactive emotions. Over time, this fragmentation produces exhaustion rather than liberation. The psyche demands coherence, and coherence requires that the ego assume the burden of regulation. For the chosen individual, responsibility arrives early and heavily. They sense, often without understanding why, that their actions carry disproportionate weight. Choices reverberate inwardly with unusual intensity. Neglecting inner duties results in immediate psychological consequences. Anxiety, guilt, restlessness. This sensitivity is not weakness. It is a sign that the psyche is already oriented toward a higher degree of integration. Responsibility also involves restraint. Not every impulse deserves expression, and not every truth demands proclamation. Psychological maturity is measured not by how much one can do, but by what one chooses not to do. The ego learns to serve as mediator between instinct and value, between desire and consequence. This mediation is laborious, and it often feels like limitation. Yet without it, freedom degenerates into chaos. As responsibility deepens, the individual begins to experience a paradox. The more willingly they accept inner obligation, the less they feel compelled by external pressure. When conscience is internalized, authority loses its power to intimidate. The individual no longer requires constant supervision, nor do they rebel reflexively. Their actions arise from alignment rather than defiance or compliance. This internal authority is the foundation of genuine freedom. One is free not because nothing binds them, but because what binds them has been consciously chosen. Duty imposed from outside breeds resentment. Duty assumed inwardly produces dignity. The psyche responds to this dignity with stability and confidence. Responsibility extends to the shadow as well. To be responsible is to admit one's capacity for destructiveness, manipulation, and cruelty, without acting them out unconsciously. Denial does not make these tendencies disappear, it makes them dangerous. Conscious responsibility contains them, transforming raw impulse into controlled power. There is also responsibility toward meaning. Life does not automatically provide it. Meaning must be carried, protected, and enacted. When the individual refuses this task, they experience emptiness and boredom. These are not signs that life is meaningless, but that responsibility for meaning has been neglected. Freedom emerges gradually as responsibility is integrated. It is felt as inner permission rather than outer license. The individual moves with less inner conflict, less need for justification. Actions become simpler, not because choices are fewer, but because they are more aligned. This process does not culminate in final release. Responsibility continues to evolve as consciousness expands. Each increase in freedom demands a corresponding increase in accountability. The psyche maintains this balance relentlessly, ensuring that freedom remains grounded rather than inflated, and that power remains contained within awareness. Thus, the burden becomes meaning when integrated. A burden remains unbearable only as long as it is resisted or misunderstood. When carried unconsciously, it weighs upon the individual as fate, misfortune, or injustice. When brought into awareness, it changes its nature. Integration does not remove the burden, it alters the relationship to it. What was once experienced as oppression begins to function as orientation. The psyche does not assign burdens arbitrarily. What appears as an excessive weight is often a concentration of psychic energy around an unresolved task. This task may take the form of sensitivity, intensity, or an inward demand that others do not share. The individual experiences this as difference, sometimes as defect. Yet the burden persists because it contains something essential that has not yet been given form. Integration begins when the individual stops asking why the burden exists and begins to observe how it operates. The question shifts from protest to attention. Emotional patterns, recurring conflicts, and persistent themes in dreams and relationships reveal the shape of the burden. It becomes recognizable, no longer an amorphous pressure, but a structured demand. Meaning does not arrive as an explanation imposed from above. It emerges as coherence within experience. When disparate elements of the personality begin to relate to one another, the burden finds its place. Suffering, isolation, shadow, and responsibility no longer appear as separate afflictions, but as interdependent movements within a single process. The psyche, once fragmented, begins to organize itself around a center. This center is not an idea or belief, it is a lived orientation. The individual senses that their difficulties are not obstacles to life, but expressions of it. The burden ceases to feel personal in the narrow sense and begins to feel necessary. Not necessary because it is pleasant, but because without it, the personality would remain incomplete. Integration also dissolves resentment. Resentment thrives on comparison, on the belief that one has been unfairly assigned a heavier load than others. When the burden is integrated, comparison loses relevance. The individual recognizes that their path is not interchangeable. The psyche does not measure fairness, it seeks balance. What is heavy for one is irrelevant for another. As meaning emerges, energy previously consumed by resistance becomes available for expression. The burden begins to inform action rather than obstruct it. Sensitivity becomes discernment. Suffering becomes depth. Responsibility becomes authority. Even the shadow, once feared, becomes a source of groundedness and realism. The individual is no longer at war with their own structure. This transformation does not announce itself dramatically. There is no sudden liberation. Instead, there is a quiet solidity. Decisions feel weighted, but not paralyzing. Life retains its difficulty, but it no longer feels arbitrary. The individual carries their burden as one carries a necessary tool, aware of its weight, but also of its function. Integration also alters the individual's relationship to others. Without needing to justify their burden, they cease demanding understanding. Without demanding understanding, they become more capable of genuine connection. They no longer seek rescue or recognition. Their presence communicates something steadier, a person in relationship with their own depth. Meaning, in this sense, is not optimism. It does not deny tragedy or suffering, it provides context. Pain is no longer interpreted as evidence of failure, but as movement within a larger psychological pattern. The individual remains vulnerable, but not disoriented. The burden, once integrated, continues to evolve. New layers emerge as consciousness deepens. Meaning is not fixed, it is renewed through continued engagement. The psyche does not resolve itself once and for all. It unfolds. And as long as the individual remains in dialogue with their inner reality, the burden remains alive, not as a sentence, but as a guiding weight that shapes the form of one's becoming.